We're going to talk about the cerebrospinal fluid flow pathways in the brain, and we're going to talk about where it's generated in the lateral ventricles and how it flows through the system to get out and around the outside of the brain. So the CSF is created in the lateral ventricles. Those are inside either hemisphere of the brain, and then the fluid flows through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, which sits on the midline, and then it flows through the cerebral aqueduct down to the fourth ventricle, and then it exits out and goes around to bathe the spinal cord and the outside of the brain. So to see that better, we're going to look at it in 3D. And so we have here a head model where we can turn the skull off, and we're left with the brain underneath. And let me just make the brain transparent here. And you can see the cerebrospinal fluid pathways in the brain, and we're going to look at those in some detail. So first we'll rotate the brain around to look at it from the top, and you can see the lateral ventricles that extend into either hemisphere. Those lateral ventricles come together into the midline, and then they go in through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, which is here on the midline, and then they exit out the bottom of that through the cerebral aqueduct, going down to the fourth ventricle at the base of the brain, and then they go out, where then they bathe the outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So we can look at that again from the front view, and we can see from the front view the two lateral ventricles, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct going down to the fourth ventricle. While we have this brain here, we can also look at a few other things. We talked in class about the arrangement on the surface of the cortex of the motor homunculus and the sensory homunculus. And so we have here an image of that where we have the motor cortex that sits in front of the sensory cortex, and that gets arranged on the brain on either side. And so we can kind of line that up here with this brain, showing the motor and the sensory cortex sitting together here in the brain. And then along each one of those, along the motor and along the sensory cortex, we have a map of the body laid out that's called a homunculus. And so we can grab this homunculus here, and we can see what it would look like lined up with one of those gyri in the brain. And so let me make this a little bit bigger. As we overlay it, you can see that the foot and leg regions are on the midline here, and then we go out to the outside where we have the hand and fingers here, and then when we go down to the side of the brain, we have the lips and tongue. Okay, so that's the homunculus. We have a sensory homunculus and a motor homunculus. The particular one shown here is the sensory homunculus. Okay, so thank you for your attention.